Um, it's 7 days into the new year. 7 days. And last year, I declared Kate Hoey the worst Brexiteer, like, of all time. And we are 7 days in, and honestly, if this was like a yearly award, Kate Hoey has already just won it. Because let me remind you why Kate Hoey is such a bad, and I think far worse than Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Daniel Hannan. You can name me any Brexiteer, and I will say this now: Kate Hoey is like 100 times worse. 100 times worse. Because this was the woman who, in particular, was brought forward by the Leave campaign to first of all represent the idea that there are Labour MPs who didn't want to remain in the European Union. She was representing the Leave part of Labour and continues to this day that, oh, there were really all these secret, Labour MPs who really wanted to campaign for Leave but couldn't bring themselves to do it, or were a bit scared to do it. Never mentions any names, of course, about this. Again, fair point of bringing up. That should probably be brought up to at some point. But she has really continued to push this idea that during, of course, the referendum, whenever Northern Ireland was brought up, of course, she was, of course, being from Northern Ireland herself, would always be the one who was pushed forward by the Leave campaign to put forward, say, actually, if we leave, Northern Ireland is just not going to be an issue. Because remember, at the time, Leave and the Brexiteers have continuously pushed the goalposts for an ever harder, more harsher Brexit than what they were originally advertising during 2016. Remember the infamous Daniel Hannan quote, only a fool would leave the single market and customs union. And yet, we are about to hear from an absolute fool. This is, of course, Katie Hoey, or Kate Hoey, whatever, in the Belfast newsletter, with an op-ed piece about what she said Brexit really meant, which is kind of funny because if this is what Brexit really meant, why weren't you telling people this during the referendum? So before we go getting into her nonsense that she's written, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page, the One Off Today link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And of course, as always, there is the One Off Today link called the YouTube thank you button. There's the Pony Club as well down below. And of course, as always, thank you very much for all the support that you guys show your channel, show the channel, and of course, remember to leave a comment down below as well. So let's crack on over into this. So this is Kate Hoey, who says, remember, this was not her position during the referendum. So she says, any deal which doesn't restore Northern Ireland to the Union by ending EU law isn't consistent with unionism's objectives. Bear in mind, there are a lot of unionists, including the DUP, who would say things like the Good Friday Agreement isn't consistent with unionism's objectives. Does she agree with them, I wonder? Because she's about to argue, of course, you'll notice EU law, she's about to argue that actually Brexit meant that we should be leaving the European Court of Justice. Which, again, one of the big guarantees of the Good Friday Agreement, that any disputes would be mediated by a neutral third party. And of course, that is the European Court of Justice. And now, if we leave that, as we've said before, throws the entire Good Friday Agreement into question and possibly destroys one of the most successful peace agreements in history. But Kate Hoey, Brexit, Northern Ireland, not going to be a problem. Yeah, has been the consistent problem for Brexiteers. And of course, convenient to support it when they were, shall we say, trying to get rid of Theresa May. But the second that they realized, well, actually, this is stopping us from having, Brexit, they threw the DUP under the bus, who had just been, well, literally helping them to throw Theresa May under the bus as well. So, yeah, it's again so bizarre. But anyway, on to what she has said. So, she has said that Brexit has meant leaving the EU single market, again, not what Leave was arguing for during the referendum, the customs union, once again, not what Leave was arguing for, and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, also never once mentioned by the Leave campaign. But anyway, she continues. It is beyond dispute that in regards to Northern Ireland, Brexit has not been done, but rather could be more accurately be described as have been undone. Northern Ireland remains in practice part of the EU single market and is treated as an entry point into and is thus part EU territory. Yes, because as we've said multiple times and was brought up, if you leave the single market and customs union, that means you've got to have a border. Under the rules of the Good Friday Agreement, there can be no hard border between the North of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, meaning you've got to have it then in the sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And bear in mind, Kate Hoey also doesn't mention here that Northern Ireland, when you compare it to the other regions of the UK, if you exclude London, has been outperforming every single other area economically because it is still in the single market and customs union. And one of the big reasons why people like Kate Hoey and other Brexiteers are still sort of desperate to drag it out is because of that. Because they know that if there is another campaign to rejoin the EU, you can just point to the fact that look how good Northern Ireland is doing as a part of the UK. All its businesses and etc. is all flourishing compared to the rest of the UK. And they do not want that example. They do not want that obvious thorn in their side. But she continues. Great Britain is treated as a foreign country in relation to Northern Ireland, whereas Northern Ireland is treated as part of the regulatory territory of the EU. This is the fundamental cause of the Irish Sea border and the constitutional harm it brings. Then maybe the rest of the UK should join the customs union and single market then. After all, that was your position during the referendum. This all flows from the fatal double concession by the UK government that Northern Ireland had to retain unfettered access to the EU single market, and interconnected with that, there could be no Irish land border. Bear in mind, she's being very sneaky here and not saying why that had to happen. Yeah, why did that have to happen? Was it the Good Friday Agreement? So this created the necessity for Northern Ireland to be required to follow EU law. Otherwise, how would the EU single market be protected? And therefore to be a border in the Irish Sea to prevent goods from Great Britain, which are not subject to EU law, flowing into the EU single market. Yep, you've got to have a border somewhere. Something else the Brexiteers did not understand. Look at the ridiculous remarks that Jacob Rees-Mogg made about having this wonderful digital cyberpunk border that Brexiteers like him salivated over the idea of. Again, never actually could show any examples of one working or a company that could produce one, just their cyberpunk fantasy dream. So this meant and continues to mean, in the words of Lord Justice McCluskey, that our protocol legal challenge that NI belongs more to the EU market than to the UK market. This creates an economic united island in large parts of our economy and is beyond any doubt. There may be an argument as to just how much our economy is subsumed into alignment with the Irish Republic and is divorced from the UK, but that is a question of degree rather than from such a constitutional harm that it has been. Inflicted, it obviously has. And why has that had to be? You are not being honest about the reason. And this is why I will say right from now, I think this is why Kate Hoey is easily the most dishonest out of all the Brexiteers. She's not saying why that reason is. The reason why that is the Good Friday Agreement. And the fact that she cannot even bring herself to say that just goes to show her how dishonest this whole thing is. So he continues, it would be an extraordinary situation if unionism found itself in the terrain of arguing that all is fine because we are only part of an economically united island, but still half or a quarter in the UK economically. It would essentially resolve to argue that Northern Ireland should be semi-detached from the UK and have some form of hybrid constitutional status. Well, bear in mind, you argued for this. As we warned you during the referendum, there would be these consequences. We were constantly saying, where do you put the border? This was the question during the referendum. It was put to the question after. And of course, the Brexiteers said, no, this is not going to be an issue. And Theresa May put forward the idea of the backstop, which would essentially keep all the UK in a customs union. Because of this, Brexiteers absolutely threw a hissy fit because they could not stand that idea as a solution, because then they weren't going to get true Brexit. So obviously she had to go, and of course the DUP gladly helped, shall we say, uh, give her the elbow, along with many of the other Brexiteers at the time. And then along came Boris Johnson and gladly gave them the old heave ho as well. So it is important to understand that this is the constitutional price that must be paid for unfettered access to the EU single market. There is no equal dual access if you want unfettered access to the EU single market. Then you must be semi-detached from the UK market. Otherwise, it would be amount to the whole UK having unfettered access to the EU, and that is impossible. With a border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, no, you've got to have a border. Like this. She's even getting the argument wrong. It's not a matter of just the UK will just magically have unfettered access to the EU. No, there must be a border because you've got to physically check goods somewhere. There has to be a border. And this is just to show you the whole thing that she can't even have a proper conversation about this. Anyway, that, it seems to me, is the wholly incoherent position to adopt from any unionist, as Sam Wilson, the MP for JP Alcalister KC, and Jamie Bison have set out into detail and committed into writing in the past number of days. You can have unfettered access to the EU single market, or you can be full part of the UK. You can't have both. And that is it. And unanimously, remember, Northern Ireland did vote quite heavily in favour of Remain. So their arguments, of course, each formulated in very different ways, but align in the substance, and the central conclusion are demonstrably correct. In equal terms, you cannot have unfettered access to the EU market, which brings with it the imposition of EU law and an Irish sea border for the reasons that I have outlined in summary form. You also haven't mentioned, the Good Friday Agreement. Very bizarre you aren't mentioning that. I will call that out, and should be called out for. And it's consistent with Article 6 in the Act of Union of 1800, which has been and hopes to remain the central constitutional test for all unions, and indeed was first of the DUP's 7 key tests. And even they are now having to accept that this is the reality they helped create. This is their mess. They made it. And they explicitly got rid of Theresa May so that they could have this. This was everything that apparently they wanted until they got it, and then they realized, oh, actually, we don't want this. Anyway, Article 6 of the Act of Union means that the substantiary provision of the constitutional guarantee that you cannot subjectively deduce a meaning which is inconsistent with the text of Article 6 itself. The meaning, the requirements for constituency with the central constitutional provision is set out in detail in the judgments in our court of our protocol legal case. Again, they are still obsessed with this idea that they can put a legal challenge and challenge this in the courts. But they just can't. Every single time they fail because the government passed the Westminster Protocols. They've passed this, so it's in law. It is constitutional. You have to somehow say how do you then solve, of course, the problem of the Good Friday Agreement. Of course, Kate Hoey not even once mentioned so far the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, the fact that the European Court of Justice is one of the third-party guarantors of any dispute that should arise during that thing. Again, we leave that throws the entire Good Friday Agreement out the window. And that will have very, very bad outcomes. I urge all unionists to try and familiarize themselves with that material. If unionism were to return to Stormont as implementers of the central concepts of the protocol and is embedding the framework, and worse still, acted as advocates, which, other than openly admitting an abject surrender, would be a necessity to save face. So, Kate Hoey arguing here that people like the DUP and unionists should not climb down from their current position and should remain out of Stormont, even though during the referendum, Northern Ireland overwhelmingly voted to remain in the EU, has since voted for parties that are pro-protocol. No, the DUP should continue to deny and abstain from the democratic process and just be an obstacle for basically people in Northern Ireland. I've said before, it is entirely unfair for the DUP to keep on doing this. This is their bed. This is their fault. They made this. They apparently wanted this. And then, of course, they suddenly didn't want this all of a sudden. And yet still constantly try and argue that this isn't really what they wanted. But that's exactly what they wanted. Yeah, this is like... Again, this is the big problem with Brexiteers when it comes to discussing this. But there you go. Anyway, so for the constitutional hybridity and the imposition of EU law that flows from unfettered access to the EU single market, the union will never be restored. This issue is fundamental, and alas, unionism faces a fundamental choice. That is not a dispute between the purity and pragmatism. No, it is. It is a dispute between purity and pragmatism. The pragmatic outcome would be for the DUP to accept that this is their bed, and Kate Hoey to accept this is their bed. They made it. They should lie in it. They should have to accept the consequences of their actions. They were told many, many times by experts saying, how do you solve these problems? And people like Kate Hoey said, oh, Northern Ireland, not going to be a problem. So, this is not a dispute between purity and pragmatism. This is about the very essence of the union itself and whether unionism will accede to self-inflicting irreparable constitutional harm. Any deal which doesn't fully restore Northern Ireland to the union by ending EU law, for forgoing unfettered access to the EU market and removing the Irish Sea border, all necessary components of restoring the Acts of Union, it isn't consistent with the union's objectives or the DUP's mandate. Where then do we put the border, Kate? Where do we put it? You've got to put a border somewhere. You can't put it between um you can't put it between the North of Ireland and the Republic. Where do you put the border? This is the question. This is the question that we have been asking. That if you don't want a border in the Irish Sea, then the only reasonable outcome for this is that all the UK should rejoin, uh, certainly the customs union, or even both the customs union and single market. Which, bear in mind, I want to remind you, was the position of the Leave during the 2016 referendum that we would not be leaving the single market and customs union. And it has only been because the government got overtaken by hardcore Brexiteers who pushed for a ever harder Brexit that they knew full well if they had advocated for at the referendum, they would have never have won. And yet, why are we seeing people want to return to things like the single market customs union here in the UK? Ever increasing numbers, because we recognize the damage that it's caused, that Leave lied when they made those promises that we wouldn't be leaving the customs union or the single market. And yet you've got Kate Hoey here who refuses to really acknowledge the true cause of what is causing the problems in Northern Ireland. Again, being the Good Friday Agreement. And I noticed she mentions the democratic mandate that the DUP have. What about when Northern Ireland overwhelmingly voted to remain in Europe? For some reason, that goes out the window. And this is why I will say Kate Hoey, the the worst Brexiteer, and still is the worst Brexiteer, because she is still, even in the article, as you saw, cannot name the real reason why the DUP is so angry. Because even the DUP have said multiple times, we would love to get rid of the Good Friday Agreement. They can't even accept that. And we're one of the biggest opponents to the Good Friday Agreement initially. But even then, they had and were forced to accept the Good Friday Agreement. But even now, they see this as an opportunity to try and get rid of it, because their whole 7 tests and the version that they want would basically just mean, yeah, we just want to scrap the whole Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement. Yep. um, Kate Hoey, remember, said back in 2016, Northern Ireland not going to be a problem. Words fail me. Words really, really do fail me sometimes. But of course, it's just another Brexiteer being wrecked by Brexit. So, as always, thank you very much for watching, and of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.